Hello everyone who decided to watch this video. Today I am here to share some probably very unpopular opinions again. Something I am very good at doing, but no one ever tells me it's wrong because opinions can't be wrong and that is fact. Today's video is about the popular former FNAF artist AberrantPaint, who I will be calling Quinn throughout this video, in respects to her former internet title. If you do not know who AberrantPaint or Grau Wolf Quinn is, I will give you a short summary, as you may recognize the description once you hear it, especially if you were a FNAF fan in 2017 or so. Quinn is a DeviantArt artist with almost 40k watchers, the equivalent to followers, as of this time. She is most notorious for being the creator of Springtrap and Deliah, a webcomic featuring an AU of FNAF, where Springtrap spends the entire comic trying not to let Deliah find out he was a murderer, and I'll get to all this later on. A few other projects of hers are Ask Goldie Anything, an Ask series featuring the FNAF cast, How to Fear Monsters, an older comic featuring a relationship between the crying child and Nightmare Fredbear, and lastly Cuddlebunny, a more recent comic currently being remade about Quinn's original character Sam, as well as a prior Ask series featuring this character, which I'm not going to review in this video. Otherwise, she is pretty well known for being a prominent figure in the FNAF community from around 2016 to 2019, and maybe even now as well. Springtrap and Deliah being her most popular around that time, although not her longest running comic. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to my brand new series MCritiques, or MCritiques, I don't know how it's pronounced actually. Sit back, relax, and enjoy, unless of course you've come to leave a hateful comment because you believe Quinn is the best person in the entire universe, which may I remind you is not healthy behavior to be in, but you've heard this a million times already, so anyways, enjoy. This series is mostly meant to review someone's overall art, but today I've decided to mostly focus on Quinn's comics, since she has established herself as a comic creator. I'll try my best to explain what main issues might pop up for the average viewer, as well as some stuff that I, a comic creator myself, have noticed that could be improved. Some stuff, like story, may also be touched on later on. So yeah, hopefully this can educate you a bit on comic making if you plan to do it yourself. The first comic she officially started posting to DeviantArt was Ask Goldie Anything, the first Ask submission being created August 2nd, 2016, and the first official question being responded to on the same day. Which is kind of impressive, I'm not gonna lie. The art featured in the actual comic is, well, it's not very good. I do understand that it was created in 2016, and at the time she would have been around 15 or so, but the art in this is really minimal effort at best, especially seeing some of the other art she posted before then. The line art is extremely messy, the dialogue is really hard to read, the backgrounds don't even exist in the first few pages, and the third Ask is quite literally just a sketch. For the character designs, they aren't much special. I do like the creative take on making the characters more independent and animal-like rather than robots, but at the same time it doesn't make much sense with the lore being presented in the series. Of course, this does later switch to the characters becoming more animatronic-like, as shown by the joints added in later on. I get that the older pages are meant to be retconned in the revival of the Ask, but they just suddenly became animatronics midway through. My point overall is that I don't get why they even perform on stage in the first place. Are they forced to? Not much is really explained when it comes to the interesting lore, just the supposed bite of 87, which was later confirmed to be a whole separate bite. But yes, I know, it's an AU, you don't have to tell me, like Quinn has already shoved in our faces many times. The overall layouts of the comics are very messy. The boxes are very small, and you can hardly even call them boxes, which I bring this up because it's a bit of a problem in her current comics now. The frames are way too small, and the comic background is way too prevalent. The backgrounds are also inconsistent between frames, which is probably due to her drawing the backgrounds differently in each frame, which, I mean, you can always just copy, like, combine all the layers or whatever of the background and then, copy it over to the other frames, but you know, she's doing her own thing. Which, it's not very noticeable at first glance, but it's still noticeable, you know? Because I noticed it, and I'm very observant, as you've probably noticed. Overall, I don't think the character designs are all that special. The art style isn't very pleasing to look at. The coloring and shading is probably the best part about it, since it manages to capture some sort of aesthetic at times. Overall, I think this was originally very overrated. And although the Ask series of FNAF characters didn't exist much back then, with the exception of AberrantPaint, which I've made a video on, this is gonna come up a lot, it's really low effort. After a few of the Ask Goldie Anything stuff, Quinn moved on to working on a few other small comics, one of which being How to Fear Monsters. Some other short comics featuring Springtrap and Deliah characters, as well as her first sonas, which were being posted as well, putting Ask Goldie Anything on a bit of a smaller priority list. Overall, I think most of the critiques I put on Ask Goldie Anything apply here as well. The line art is messy, the backgrounds are usually an afterthought, and the shading and coloring continue to be the highest point of the comics. Any Sona-related comic, or non-FNAF comic, as well as other art, would not get nearly as much of the attention that the other stuff got. This, of course, probably got Quinn's motivation a lot higher to work on that kind of stuff, as she would usually mention getting back to those comics at some point in the descriptions. Which, I mean, I don't really get, I understand that a lot of people were following her because of that, but she can always make status updates instead, I'm just saying. I don't have a problem with any of these comics in general, and thankfully they were an improvement to her older stuff, and thankfully the text bubbles are no longer handwritten. Springtrap and Deliah is what really gave Quinn her main form of popularity. As brought up in one of my previous videos, FNAF is a community mostly made up of young children, despite its focus material being of creepy animatronics who are trying to kill the main character, and lots of other death-related stuff. Great way to teach your children about death, you know? But I digress. I'll try to focus this review more on the story, since the comic is extremely story-based, rather than being more focused on character development and whatnot, you know, excluding Springtrap. Like, there's a lot of story to that guy, but I'll get to that later. However, I will spend the first portion of this reviewing her overall art and character designs. Starting with the first few pages, the most noticeable thing the casual viewer may notice when going from the remade page 1 to page 2 is that the atmosphere is non-existent. The lighting and shading is overall pretty dull and is very messy. It does have a very natural atmosphere, but considering the artistic choices she uses both later in the comic and in her previous artwork, as well as her style being more on the stylistic side, it doesn't seem all that pleasant to look at. It can also be inconsistent at times, with the shading sometimes facing in directions that it otherwise wasn't or shouldn't be in. The line art and coloring is just, if not more messy than the shading, which is quite a feat if I do say so myself. The coloring often appears to escape the line art, mostly due to it being messier. And can I just say, what even happened here? The anatomy is good overall, and I think the general original design for Springtrap, being the one shown in the first 10 pages or so, was probably the best one. The colors are nice and bland, which work well with Springtrap's character. I also think the double scars are a nice fierce addition, considering he's a murderer and all. And I think all the visible inner workings and light blood stains once again gave him more of that mysterious kind of character, which, you know, fits his character. The aesthetic and backgrounds are later more established after page 6, when the comic went into a month-long hiatus where Quinn states she was trying to get better at drawing backgrounds, and probably shading stuff as well. For the later pages, focusing specifically on pages 17 through 113 mostly, I would have to say that the art style is probably my least favorite here. Springtrap's design got a bit more innocent, as the more visible joints and stains were removed. Springtrap's eyes became more of a natural color, excluding his pupils, of course. The aesthetic and shading is probably at its absolute best here. The shading is not lazily done, there's a clear aesthetic for each scene, and it's overall very pleasing to look at. Backgrounds are not present when the time calls for their absence best. Of course, the shading does get slightly lazier around the middle of this time frame, but it does come back up to full scale back around the later pages. For Nightmare Springtrap's design here, I personally love it. It shows the true chaos that Springtrap is trying to hide behind closed doors, just by the way he looks. I don't really understand the tentacle pulls, but you know, it kinda adds to the chaos, I suppose, and totally not for... You know what, it's fine. Moving on to the later pages, being pages 114 to the end, and you know, that counts both endings. I'd say the designs and shading are probably at their weakest point. For some reason, Springtrap drastically changed color to more of a brownish than a yellow. I do think the color change is probably for the better, though it's just a bit too vibrant for the kind of character he's meant to be. He also loses one of his scars, which was completely pointless. He looked even better with two, but for some reason he lost one, I guess. He probably didn't retrace his steps or something, and yeah, now we're all disappointed. The aesthetic pretty much disappears here, and the shading goes back to being much lazier, as well as the backgrounds being once again more of an afterthought. Our art style in general just somehow decreased in quality at this point. Now for the story. I hate it. I hate the story. There's just so much wrong with it. I do like the concept of a murderer trying to hide his urges and try to live a happier life. I don't know, he's kinda dead. Maybe it's a half-life, but the way it's presented in the comic is beyond lazy and makes no sense. Springtrap basically leads Harry, Deliah's friend, into a room and basically admits that he killed kids. The reason for this is that Harry is friends with Deliah, and Springtrap doesn't want them to be friends because it means Deliah spends less time with him. But later in the comic, they end up spending more time together, and Springtrap ends up admitting the truth in the end anyways. So what's the point of the comic? I get it's meant to be Springtrap getting the courage to tell Deliah he's a murderer, but just don't say it to random strangers for no reason. Or just don't tell her at all. This story makes no sense. And although entertaining at points, it's overall just a waste. There's a lot of lore built up around Springtrap that hardly goes anywhere. It's basically just him basically telling Harry, once again, that he is in fact a murderer and that he did not mishear him and that his phone also did not mishear him. The story could have gone in so many other places. It could have started with Springtrap having told Deliah that he's a murderer and Deliah tries to find ways to live with him, eventually leading to Deliah gaining confidence that Springtrap is a friendly guy. Or even taking it in a totally different direction. It could have been about Springtrap's descent into killing the children in the first place, which honestly would have been really interesting. Overall, the story is wasted potential and was presented in some pretty terrible ways at points. Turns out, as of late 2019, Ask Goldie Anything got a reboot that basically changed the lore established in the previous Asks. Why? If you didn't like where the story was going, then just cancel the whole thing or start a new series altogether. Especially since you're kind of exiting the FNAF fanbase by the sounds of it. Or even start an original universe or something. Also, small detail, but the puppet is in the cover of the reboot despite showing up in the reboot only once as an introduction. So yeah, another waste there. Overall, it's a big improvement from the original series. The lighting is much less lazy than it was. The comics are actually full-on answers to questions rather than being small 1 to 4 panel answers, which could have easily just been a single image. I also like the inclusion of original characters as well. It makes for more of a story, although less interesting than the original in my opinion. But, you know, that still wasn't very good on its own. Overall, it's a lot better, and it does show more storytelling and artistic effort, so good job. Unfortunately, as of the time of making this video, Cuddlebunny has been deleted and is possibly getting a remake, even though it sounds like that Quinn might not be on DeviantArt for that much longer. So everything here will be provided on memory and a page that I happened to save beforehand. It's terrible. Honestly, this was even worse than the original Ask Goldie Anything. The line art is beyond messy, constantly intersecting lines with each other. The shading constantly escapes the line art and goes in unnatural places. The frames are messy. Proportions are also unnatural. Character designs are overall pretty bland and don't offer much. There's quite literally a 15-year or so time skipped after 2 pages of the comic. with some of the worst foreshadowing I've ever seen, along with some terrible framing. I mean, just look at this frame for a second. Just look at it. Overall, with 5 pages that were released, it's very ugly and quite obviously very rushed, as Quinn has said before. The storytelling is all over the place, and the aesthetic is pretty much non-existent, as well as the backgrounds and shading being a massive afterthought. I'm glad she's decided to go back and remake it, as it really needed a remake. Overall, Quinn is not the best artist. Her art is not clean and honestly not all that pleasing or even unique. Her storytelling needs improvement, and her comic formatting is mediocre at best. It was probably best in Springtrap and Deliah, to be honest. She is a good artist, I will give her that, but it still has a lot that needs work. Hey, so while I was making this video, Quinn deactivated her account. I predicted this, but I didn't think it was gonna happen this soon. So, yeah, I don't know if this all still matters, but yeah, her account's gone. And do with that information what you will. This was basically meant to be a bit of an art critique for those who are developing artists. I am planning to make some art guides at some point, as well as I said, making a series about critiquing artists, so if you're interested in that, stay tuned. Have a good Sunday, gamers, and I will see you another day.